Welcome back to the Cryosphere Pavilion at COP30 in Belém, Brazil. So we have Permafrost Day today, and now we're heading into our second and last session of the day. So for this session we're going to focus on recent research results, new papers that have come out in the last few years, and also give you an overview of some emerging topics on subsea permafrost and impact to peoples, and also quite a lot talking, of course, about the carbon cycle and climate. So my name is Gustav Hugelius. I'm a professor of physical geography at Stockholm University and also vice director of the Bolin Center for Climate Research at Stockholm University. And I'm a permafrost researcher. So I'm going to start us off today by giving a bit of first a brief introduction to what permafrost is, and then talk about some recent papers that are showing us that permafrost thaw is actually already warming the global climate, and that the shift from a long-term sink of carbon into a net source of warming has already occurred. So I'm going to start by showing you an animation or a graph that is a summary of different projections of future loss of permafrost, future permafrost thaw. You see an image across the circumpolar Arctic, with Canada to the east and Russia to the west, if you're unfamiliar with the view. And the different colors show you permafrost extent in different times. So orange is the baseline, the extent of permafrost that we had in the 1960s to 1990s, and ideally the extent we would want to keep, right? And then when you go into the consecutively more red colors, you have the permafrost that will be left at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, up to 5 degrees of global warming. So we see that in the high warming scenario, permafrost is essentially gone everywhere except the coldest parts of Siberia. But I think the most striking part of this map is actually the very stark difference between the baseline and already 1.5 degrees of warming. So you see that already there, much of the permafrost is lost, both to the south, but also far north into the permafrost region. So these are projections into the future. Okay, now it's working again. But actually permafrost is already thawing. This image shows you a simulation from the year 2001 until 2021. So you can see, if you, depending on how far back in the audience you are, if you squint a little bit, you can see how permafrost is already creeping northwards. So we're seeing a loss of permafrost along the southern edges. So with the warmest areas, permafrost is already disappearing, and it's happening quite rapidly. So this is the places where permafrost is completely gone. But this other map that I'm showing you now actually shows a different side of the same, sort of a different side of the same coin. This map shows you not where permafrost is gone, but actually the rate of warming. So instead we're seeing the subsurface temperature change at 2 meters depth from 1997 to 2019. And here you see this very intensely red area is actually not in the south, but in northern Siberia. So in the really cold northern parts of Russia, this is where permafrost is warming the most. So permafrost is not just disappearing along the edges. The whole zone is being affected, and this affects the carbon cycle, people living there, ecosystems, and all of the other components. And the main driver behind this sort of rapid warming in the north is probably the loss of sea ice that is really increasing the regional warming in this area a lot. So there are these couplings between different cryosphere elements. So I want to also take a bit of a step back and talk a little bit about permafrost in the cryosphere in general. We're in the cryosphere pavilion, so there are presentations from all sorts of different cryosphere elements here, different frozen parts of the planet. And here we see the area in million square kilometers of the main cryosphere elements. Sea ice covers the largest area, 25 million square kilometers. Permafrost is the second largest at 17. Then you have the Antarctic ice sheet, Greenland, and glaciers, successively smaller areas. So you see here that permafrost is one of the bigger components of the cryosphere system. And these different components all have different important global climate or other types of feedbacks. With sea ice, we're mainly concerned about albedo. Loss of sea ice means that less sunlight is reflected back into the atmosphere, warming the Earth. With permafrost, we're mainly concerned about carbon, but of course other things as well. And when it comes to the ice sheets and glaciers, we're concerned about sea level rise. But actually, if we look at not just the loss of permafrost itself, but look at the loss of pure ice, the actual ice loss, Permafrost is actually also losing substantial amounts of ice. So you see here the gigatons of ice that's lost every year, which ranges from, the highest is right now in mountain glaciers, although this will, as the ice sheets start losing more and more, of course they will grow that ice loss. But you see that right now the loss of ice, the pure ground ice from permafrost, is on par with ice loss in Antarctica. So it also has other impacts, for instance on sea level rise, which we'll hear more about later. But the main reason that we are concerned with permafrost thaw, and the main focus that we have on our research programs, is the permafrost climate feedbacks. So this is a feedback where global warming thaws permafrost, which in turn leads to greenhouse gas release as organic matter that's been stored, frozen in the permafrost, becomes available for decomposition. So microbes eat at the previously frozen plant remains that were in the permafrost, and as a byproduct they produce either methane or CO2. So this image shows you an example of very dramatic thawing permafrost. This is from the Canadian Arctic. But what you see is, the post-thaw environment in the front of the picture is fundamentally very, very different to what it looks like before permafrost is thawing. So this has climate impacts, but also, of course, as the landscapes change this dramatically, you also have impacts to ecosystems, infrastructure, and human activities, which we'll also hear more about later in the session. But the reason we're so concerned about permafrost thaw and the carbon cycle is the massive size of the permafrost carbon pool. This diagram shows you quite a lot of different things, but the bubbles. The size of the bubbles are proportional to the size of carbon stocks in different components of the Earth's carbon cycle. So we have the atmosphere at almost 900 gigatons in the blue circle, all global vegetation about 500 gigatons. And then you have the big brown circle in the middle is all global soils, which is the largest carbon pool that turns over on these shorter timescales, which is a little bit more than 3,000 gigatons. But you see in orange in the sort of middle here is actually the global permafrost region, roughly 1,500 or 1,600 gigatons of carbon stored in this region. Even though it's not a massive part of the Earth system, it has such high carbon density that it stores this really large part of carbon. And recent papers have also pointed to the subsea permafrost system, so frozen seafloor underneath shallow Arctic oceans storing massive amounts of carbon as well, adding up almost 3,000 extra petagrams of carbon in the subsea system. Now this is not responding perhaps as rapidly yet as the terrestrial system. It's thawing rapidly, but we're not yet seeing very large carbon fluxes, but they might come in the future. So this map shows you how this carbon is distributed across the permafrost region. The dark green areas are very carbon dense, typically areas with a lot of peatlands, frozen peatlands that are very carbon dense. And in the dark blue you see this very carbon dense subsea permafrost regions as well. And then we also have this pinkish outline which shows you the extent of a particular type of ice-rich and very vulnerable permafrost called Jedoma, which is also particularly prone to thawing very rapidly and giving you large impacts on the landscape. So now I'm going to switch over to talk a little bit about research results which have shown that the permafrost region is not just projected to thaw in the future. The thaw is already now actually really affecting and even shifting the greenhouse gas balance from this region. So there was a big project called RECAP 2, which put together permafrost region greenhouse gas budgets for CO2, methane and nitrous oxide. And taken together, if you combine all of these greenhouse gases, we see that the region is already a net source of warming. So we're already warming the global climate. And this is contrary to what climate models typically show. The climate models don't have all of these processes, so in the models, the region still comes out as being a net sink because of growing carbon uptake in forest, but the new estimates show that this is no longer the case. The budget is still a little bit uncertain, so I'm going to just go a little bit mention the highlights and the complications that we find in this budget. And essentially we've used two different approaches to making budgets. One is called bottom-up, which is basically measurements on the ground that we scale up. Also models based on data from the ground scaling up, which is here in blue. And the other one is top-down models, which is essentially measurements of atmospheric concentrations that you then model backwards and try to figure out where the carbon should have come from on Earth, which is called inverse modeling. So both use data, both approaches use data and models, but they come to slightly different results. And the pink numbers are more in line with global budgets that have very very coarse and poor resolution above the permafrost zone, while the blue results from bottom up are more locally anchored, you could say. But basically what this graph shows us is a total budget calculated as CO2 equivalents per year for the three greenhouse gases, CO2, methane and nitrous oxide. And if you're above the line, it's a source into the atmosphere. If you're below, it's a sink into the ground. So basically we have divergence for CO2, where the top-down models actually still shows a sink, while the bottom-up models in this case are indicating it's neutral, basically. But for both methane and nitrous oxide, the methods agree that it's already a source of warming into the atmosphere. And this here is calculated with a 100-year global warming potential. If you recalculate, which is then the accumulated warming that happens over 100 years from today. So how much does today's greenhouse gas emissions warm the atmosphere in the coming 100 years? If you go back to a 20-year time period, so closer to home, to where we are now, both methods actually show a net warming. So it depends also on how you calculate the results and over what time interval. So this is a summary of, we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details, but this graph here summarizes the different components of the system. And if you summarize it, it's basically CO2 is still being taken up by growing boreal forests. The trees that are healthy are still growing and they're accumulating carbon. But this is basically offset by emissions from inland waters. Lake and streams actually emit a lot of greenhouse gases. There's increasing fires and also wetland emissions. It basically balances out and you end up with a net warming. And this budget is calculated from year 2000 to the year 2020, which is also important. We'll get back to that later. And then there was another more recent paper that came actually this year, which focusing only on CO2, which gave us a more nuanced and detailed picture of the Arctic CO2 balance. So this is work by Anna Virkala and many colleagues, and essentially upscaled what they can find, the best available data, upscaled using different advanced statistical methods. They find that the boreal forest is largely still a sink in blue in this map, while most of the tundra region has transformed into a source. So the net effect is that the whole permafrost region is also, in their study, quite a strong actually source of warming. And you see this massive red areas, which can be fires or other intensive disturbances affecting the tundra and boreal region. Another paper that came out very recently did a very comprehensive assessment of the methane budget using a lot of new data, also finding quite strong and consistent methane sinks. You see the map of methane source emissions to the left, and to the right is like a stacked bar graph that shows you there's a small sink in the boreal forest here below zero, and all of these other different types of ecosystems are strong methane sources into the atmosphere, with the green colors being dominated by different types of wetlands. And I also mentioned that our earlier budget only went as far as to 2020, and since 2020 we've actually seen even stronger intensification of the fire regime and the fire cycle in the Arctic, even so further strengthening this source of warming. This is a Twitter feed from the Weather Channel from 2023. In this year there was a record fire year in Canada, and wildfires in Canada alone emitted on the scale of the whole EU that year. So those are the direct emissions, and after this, permafrost will keep thawing in these areas, and it will keep being a source for a long time into the future. And so you see in this image already fires occurring all across Canada, and what's really crucial here is that the date is June 6th. So this is super early. Boreal forest is not supposed to burn in the beginning of June. Boreal forests do burn naturally, but not this early. And this was, if you have really early snow melt and record heat waves, triggering fires this early in the season is really an anomaly and really an outlier. And this graph shows going back to long-term projections and looking long into the future. This is from a synthesis paper led by Ted Shure and colleagues, published now a few years ago, which just looks at different scenarios of future of permafrost-driven warming, with the CO2 emissions on this axis and methane emissions on this axis. And it shows different scenarios with different warming and different combinations of whether the emissions are dominated by methane or CO2. And you get different scenarios depending on all of these different types of futures. But I think the important thing is that if you compare the permafrost emissions, they are really on on the scale of extrapolated emissions from major emitters. So looking into the future, permafrost will emit on the scale of a large country, perhaps even more than the EU if we stay on path we are now, and if we go on even up towards 3 degrees or warmer, it's on the scale of US or China emissions by the end of the century. So this is really dire news. So summarizing, the permafrost region is already a net source of greenhouse gases and affects near-term mitigation needs. So it's already affecting us. On mid to long term, 2050 and onwards, we will see committed and profound permafrost thaw impacts, decreasing emission budgets, and really damaging infrastructure as well. And overshoot warming, which we are unfortunately basically committed to now, would trigger irreversible permafrost thaws that drives additional warming for centuries even after the climate stabilizes. Okay, so with that introduction, I will hand over the word to our next speaker. We can take questions at the end, all of us together. So the next speaker is Dr. Kristina Schädel from the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and she will give us a little bit more details into some of the things that I was mentioning, and show intriguing new results that are just coming out, basically. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm not used to speaking. Do I need to do this more? Okay, thank you. As you can see, I'm showing you a picture of permafrost. I personally find it always fascinating to actually look at permafrost because usually you're standing on top of it. You don't actually get to see it. So it's fascinating to see this, and then you also see how much ice there is in permafrost, which is one of the main features that has a huge impact on when it's warming in the Arctic. So I want to focus on 2 different types of thawing, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Generally, across the landscape overall, we have gradual thaw, which is the deepening of the active layer, where the top part of the soil thaws during the summer and then freezes back up in the winter. This is the most common form of thaw, which is happening across the entire Arctic, and each summer that thaw just goes deeper and deeper. And then, as Gustav already said, there is about 1.5 trillion tons of carbon in the permafrost region. And then the other form of thaw that is really important and has gotten much more attention is what we call abrupt thaw. And you see on the picture to the left, you see an ice wedge, and most permafrost contains ice, but in some areas there are these massive ice wedges, and there's a person in front of the ice wedge just for comparison of the size, how big those ice wedges are. And now you can imagine if it gets really warm and the ice melts, then that huge space that has been taken up by the ice will, like the ice goes away and then the ground collapses, and then you end up with a landscape that looks like the one here to the right, where it's all just collapsed. And so this has huge impacts for infrastructure that's built on permafrost, but then it also has impact obviously on like vegetation and ecosystems, and there are very deep soil layers that are suddenly exposed to much, much warmer temperatures than they otherwise would, because they would be really deep down, and that increases carbon emissions by quite a lot as well. And only about 20% of the landscape are affected by abrupt thaw, but that doesn't mean it's not important, and that's a thing that has been relatively newly identified. And then Gustav just mentioned that nicely before me. There is other impacts on permafrost thaw through wildfire. It burns a lot of the above ground vegetation, and with that, of course, a lot of carbon as well. But then the other impact that's really important to be aware of is the fire burns the organic layer, and the organic layer insulates the permafrost. And if that layer is gone, then you have really warm temperatures penetrating into the ground, and then you end up with these ice wedges melting faster, you're ending up with collapsing ground and much more destabilization. So there are these disturbance effects that are really important, but are not well enough quantified, and especially not quantified in future modeling projections. And that's where I want to go next. We have abrupt thaw and these wildfire interactions with the ground. They are not included in any of the current Earth system models that are being used for IPCC assessments, and that means we are missing a huge part of the carbon emissions from that Arctic region. So what we are doing is we're using a reduced complexity Earth system model called OSCAR, which emulates what other Earth system models are doing and uses those projections. Is it okay? Closer, because I'm hearing like some cracking. No. We're using that reduced Earth system model, and here I'm showing you the cumulative emissions in gigatons CO2 equivalent, which includes CO2 and methane, for the time frame 2025 to 2100, so for the next 75 years. And to the left, you're seeing a high mitigation scenario, so that would be SSP 1.2.6, and then to the right, a low mitigation scenario and more like current policies. And under high mitigation, we're projecting about 108 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, and under a low mitigation scenario, twice as much. But then the picture changes dramatically if we're adding these disturbance processes. And now you can see with the 3 additional bars, this is a stacked bar where each color represents the emissions from one of those components that are listed in the legend. So red shows the additional emissions from abrupt thaw, then combustion shows the additional emissions from combustion, obviously, and then you also have in the blue bar the emissions from post-fire thaw. And so with each of the mitigation scenarios, there are emissions to be expected from all of those different processes. And if you're including abrupt combustion and post-fire thaw on top of gradual thaw, you're adding 166 to 258% carbon, so more than twice as much carbon if you're accounting for all these disturbance processes. But these emissions are not included in IPCC. IPCC does recognize that additional ecosystem responses to warming from like CO2 and methane fluxes would further increase concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere, and that there's very high confidence. But those numbers are not included. There's high confidence it will happen, but they're not in there. And that causes a big problem for negotiations here, for example, or in general, when you're talking about how much carbon do we have left in order to avoid the 1.5 or 2 degree temperature target on a long-term scale. This is really, do you hear the same sound? Okay, I'm going to take this off because I hear myself. Oh, no, myself, it's crashing loudly. So this graph shows you the avoidance budget reduction, which is a complicated term, but it means if you're adding gradual thaw, abrupt thaw, and the other disturbance processes, you're reducing the available carbon budget to avoid temperature goals. And this is obviously much higher in order to avoid the 2 degree temperature target. And we've calculated that it reduces about 5 years that we have left. And that's a significant number given that we're already relatively close to these targets. And next, I want to shift a little bit to what are the impacts of permafrost emissions aside from aside from increasing emissions into the atmosphere. So we are also calculating how much warming is created just by permafrost emissions and on top of global emissions. And then we are calculating how much that warming will cause sea level rise. And then we calculate from the warming and the sea level rise, we'll calculate damage costs. So in the end, it comes down to a number, a dollar number. And these are really brand new results. They are not yet fully published. For this study, we used different scenarios that are more up-to-date than the AR6 SSP scenarios, but ultimately they are similar, just they're also standardized climate scenarios, but they have also different names, and that's why I'm showing this for net zero 2050. This is closest to SSP 1.9. The below 2 degree scenario is closest to SSP 2.6, etc. I guess you can read this yourself. But I will focus on these 4 and then eventually more on below 2 degrees and current policies. So this graph here, what I mostly want you to focus on is we have 4 different scenarios. We are seeing a distribution of warming, of global warming by 2100 in each of those, and you're focusing first on the solid line for just global warming, and that one does not include any permafrost. But then if you're including permafrost, it does shift the temperature to the right. So you have now a dotted line, which is just for each of the scenarios shifted to the right. And then another important aspect is that permafrost thaw increases the likelihood of extreme warming outcomes in the year 2100, but also in years before that as well. This is just the temperature curve only for 2100. And I think that's a really important aspect that hasn't been really looked at enough yet, that we're not only increasing overall global temperature with releasing or having a lot of permafrost carbon release, we're also increasing the likelihood of more extreme temperature outcomes. And then this next step now includes some calculations where we're using climate drivers to calculate sea level rise, and then we calculate damages for agriculture, forestry, fisheries, labor, energy and supply, floods, coast, transport and health to get an economic loss in % of GDP. And there's a lot of details in there that are absolutely not necessary here to understand, but these are published damage functions that are available for different regions. So we're getting a global number, but we're also getting % GDP damage cost function, costs for individual regions. And then we're doing these calculations with and without permafrost to see how much do we add in damage costs when we include permafrost. Now this slide here first shows just the temperature-driven economic damages in % GDP in 2100. So this is not a cumulative value, this is a in 2100 value. So there is a damage cost every single year, and this is not cumulative. And I'm just showing 2 different scenarios, the below 2 degree and the current policies. And then I picked out a few regions and the overall world in the middle. So for China, there is in 2100 a 1% damage cost right now. Sub-Saharan Africa would be 2.7, and for the world, 0.8. That doesn't sound like that much, but then this is a percentage number. So I will give you some quantitative numbers later. And then if we were adding on, so this is no permafrost, if we're adding on permafrost, the damage does increase for each of the different regions, and it increases between 0.1 and 0.6%. So under higher losses, we have higher losses under current policies than under below 2 degrees, and the poorest regions lose the largest share of GDP. I'm not sure if this was very clear here, but if you're looking at India and Sub-Saharan Africa compared to the US or China, you have a different percentage of loss. And then also permafrost adds additional damages. Now in this next picture, I'm showing temperature and sea level rise driven economic damages. So before it was just temperature, and now we're adding the damage from sea level rise. And that pretty much just doubles the damage for all of the different regions. This, I can go back to, no, I went back the wrong way. Combined temperature and sea level impacts roughly double the global economic losses. We're not assuming adaptation in this slide, but we have also done some of these calculations, and it reaches up to 10% of GDP in vulnerable regions by 2100, and that's a huge number. So I personally always need to put things a little bit more in context than just a percentage number. So I picked 3 different regions and just a scenario for current policies. If you're focusing on the very left component, the United States, in the year 2100, we have 6.85% damage cost, and then permafrost adds 0.52%. And if we're assuming the 2024 GDP for the United States is $29 trillion US, that is equivalent to a loss of $1,972 billion. And permafrost alone adds another 150 billion tons of $1 billion. And that is in 2100. you have the same number in 2099, etc. So each single year it will be this much, and it will then definitely go up the further we would go into the future. And for the other regions, we can also calculate the different, what the equivalent loss would be, and for the whole world, it's estimated at around 600 billion tons. And then here, my last slide, I'm just putting this in another context again, where for the United States, the additional 150 billion in annual losses from permafrost thaw under current policies equals about half of the Department of Education budget, which is estimated for 2024 at $268 billion, and about 1/5 of the US National Defense Program budget, which is around 841 billion tons. Billion, I don't know why I keep saying billion tons. $billion. This is not the whole military budget, but the US defense budget. Just to clarify, the military budget is much bigger. Yeah, and I'm going to leave you with that last slide, because it's not just more greenhouse gases and more warming, it ends up in damage and money that we're losing, and that's another thing that we need to consider.
Thank you very much, Christina. That's super interesting new results coming out. So I'll hand over to our third speaker, which is Fabian Seemann, who's a PhD candidate with the Alfred Wegener Institute in Potsdam, Germany. And he will tell us about permafrost carbon in the Arctic Ocean and coastal environments, so zooming in on a specific subset of this region and new results emerging from there. So please take it away, Fabian.
Thank you very much, Gustav, for the introduction. Yeah, as said, my name is Fabian Seemann, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Potsdam, Germany. And so far in the session, we have mostly talked about terrestrial permafrost, but I would like to shift the focus more now on subsea environments as well as coastal environments, as there have been key updates on this land-to-ocean continuum, but also specifically on subsea permafrost environments and coastal regions around the Arctic. So subsea permafrost has originally formed as terrestrial permafrost during glacial times when sea levels were lower compared to today, when ice was bound, or water was bound in the ice caps. Now with sea level rise after the glacials, sea levels rose, and these coastal regions became inundated and flooded by the Arctic Ocean, resulting in subsea permafrost today. And the area that is covered by subsea permafrost actually equals the area of the country size of Algeria, which is the 10th biggest country in the world, just to stress the aerial extent of subsea permafrost. Now, subsea permafrost is also warming and thawing with climate change, and this is mainly regulated by sea ice. As sea ice extent is shrinking, ocean's temperatures are increasing, and thereby also warming and thawing subsea permafrost. Generally, the subsea carbon pool is of low reactivity, but still we have current emissions from subsea permafrost by about 50 teragrams of carbon per year. Now, but there's not only subsea permafrost, it even extends further below. And here I'm going to talk about methane hydrates, which is essentially frozen methane, which is stable under low temperature and high pressure. So on the left panel, you see a plot showing the shelf area as found, for example, in Siberian coastal waters. Where you have below the water column the subsea permafrost environment, and below this permafrost domain in parts we have methane hydrates sitting, and permafrost sort of acts as a lid in these environments. But as permafrost starts to thaw out, this lid function of the permafrost weakens, potentially opening up spaces for methane hydrates to escape through the sediments into the water column and eventually to the atmosphere. And on this right picture, this is a picture from the subsea environment, the upper one from 2010, the lower one from 2019, and this is a depression on the seafloor which is about 220 meters long and 28 meters deep, showing the subsidence potential of the subsea bed, which can potentially release cause these methane hydrates destabilization. Now I would like to move on further to the coastal areas, which are highly sensitive environments due to a couple of factors. First of all, in the very first presentation from Gustav, he has mentioned already the role of ground ice content, and this is also very relevant in coastal lowland regions, where we find regions such as in Alaska with ground ice contents of 50% or more, which has a huge potential for subsidence and thereby changing ecosystems along the Arctic coastlines. Then, of course, we have shoreline erosion, or shoreline change and change rates, and how these environments can look like we can see in these pictures, which is also, of course, in combination with sea level rise highly affecting these ecosystems. So we find inundation of coastal areas, we find coastal bluff erosion, and these dynamics are changing with ongoing climate change. So historically, we have had an erosion rate around the Arctic Ocean of about 1 meter per year. Today, we are already at more than 1 meter per year, and projections until the year 2100 signalize a potential for a 2- to 3-fold increase of coastal erosion, depending on the mitigation scenario that we are taking. And the eroded material that is entering the Arctic Ocean isn't just lost, it's still relevant for the climate system, as the Arctic Ocean has a natural capacity to take up atmospheric CO2. But as additional we have additional carbon input from coastal erosion, the CO2 uptake capacity from the Arctic Ocean is reduced somewhere in the range between 7% and 14%, again, depending on the mitigation scenario that we are taking. Now still focusing on the coastal regions, but moving slightly further inland again, I want to give you some examples of how these Arctic coastal lowland areas can look like, with here an example from northernmost Alaska in Inuvialuktun. The left satellite picture is here in infrared for better contrast, so you see the reddish color presenting the land mass, and the blue greenish areas, the water areas. And then to the right, it's a picture from a flight campaign. And what you can really notice here is this is a really scattered landscape. So first of all, along the coastlines, we find lagoons, which in part result from coastal erosion, as these inland lakes are eaten up basically by coastal erosion, leading to ecosystem change, lagoon formation here in this case. And I would like to give an example what these ecosystem impacts are when we have the combination of coastal erosion, flooding, and sea level rise in these regions. So first of all, when permafrost starts to thaw, microbial activity starts, which degrades or mineralizes the organic carbon in the ground, initializing carbon dioxide, CO2 or methane CH4 production. Over time, with thaw, these production rates slow down but are still stable. But now with the simulation of sea level rise, or for example lagoon formation, where we see the shift from a freshwater environment on land to a brackish water environment by the incoming seawater, we see a mix-up basically of the microbial structures, bringing in additional microbial communities such as sulfate reducers, which lead to an enhanced greenhouse gas production in these coastal environments. And this is really the point that which I want to stress here, is that these environments are highly sensitive and relevant for the carbon system in the Arctic. Now, moving in a little step further inland again, still being located here in Arctic coastal lowlands, we also find saline deposits in the terrestrial environments, and these derive from times when sea levels were higher compared to today. These deposits are covered with Holocene deposits which are non-saline, but as we see active layers deepening and thaw beneath these thaw lakes, we see that once the thaw reaches these saline deposits, the thaw is enhancing, because if we find salinity in the landscape, the thawing point is depressed. This is why we throw salt on the streets in parts of the world, so the streets don't freeze over. So permafrost here perhaps already thaws at minus 1.5 degrees and not at 0 degrees as we would expect. And these are factors which we are not yet accounting really for in Arctic change. So the key messages I like to convey are that gas hydrates are associated with subsea permafrost, and emissions from these are not yet really fully understood and accounted for. Then the eroded material along the Arctic Ocean remains relevant in the global carbon cycle. And we find accelerated greenhouse gas production through seawater inundation, such as when we have a lagoon formation and with saline permafrost thaw. So Arctic permafrost coastal environments are highly vulnerable, and this vulnerability is relevant for the carbon cycle. So yeah, with that I'm coming to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for being here at this late hour. Handing over back to Gustav.
Thank you very much, Fabian. So now we will, there we have the references. Hand over to the last speaker of the session and of the Permafrost Day. So Professor Inuvialuktun from the Alfred Wegener Institute will tell us about permafrost in the context of people, pollution and health across the Arctic.
Thank you very much, Gustav. So my colleagues did an excellent job. Sorry, I apologize in advance. I have a very strong French accent, so you have to bear with me. That's part of the deal. My colleagues did a very excellent job at showing what it means actually for the rest of the world to when permafrost thaws and what that means for the climate. But when permafrost thaws, the first impacts are felt on the ground in the Arctic by the people who live in the Arctic. In this presentation, we're not going to touch upon like all the impacts that are visible on the ground, but some of them to highlight the kind of consequences and primarily the diversity in the consequences that are felt upon permafrost thaw. So the first thing we're looking at again is that permafrost map. And what is really interesting about this map is that we have different countries that are there, and each country has a different cultural and traditional way of embracing like the settlement of the Arctic regions. That is true in terms of architecture, in terms of engineering strategies, and that has some dire consequences in some areas in the way you can address or not the consequences of permafrost thaw. Because there are many people living in the Arctic, and if you look at that diagram here, what I'm showing you is primarily the people living in the US, here up there, Canada, Greenland, and then the small number of people living on permafrost in the Nordic countries. In total, and that's a brand new result we looked at over the past 2 years, is we think that there's around 7 million people living on permafrost. Of those 7 million people, we think that by 2050, about half of those people will not live on permafrost anymore. They will not live on permafrost anymore, not because they moved away, because they stayed there. And it is the permafrost that moved north. So that has very important consequences, because when you move from a permafrost environment to a non-permafrost environment, then the strategies to build structures on the permafrost become very different. On permafrost, you build with piles, so that you dig and you anchor your buildings into the ground so that they don't have to endure the warming. When the permafrost disappears, you can't use that technique anymore. So quite a lot of people living in the US, Canada, and Greenland, but really the bulk of the population lives in Russia. And that's going to be reflected, you'll see, in the economic impacts that are going to be happening now. Lots of very large countries as well, lots of very large industrial cities that are located on permafrost in Russia. Yakutsk being the largest one here, but cities such as Norilsk, where we have a very strong industrial complex that are located there and that are experiencing directly the consequences of permafrost thaw. In this study here that was published this year by Matteo Cordier, what we tried to compute for the first time is the value of the permafrost GDP, the permafrost GRP here, so regional, the gross regional product of permafrost. So it's really a bit of an artistic endeavor in doing that, because you deal with a lot of different data sets, and really the idea was to put the first order of magnitude out there to do that. And why do we do that is that because we have computations of the amount of costs that are required to cover the consequences of permafrost thaw, for instance, in Alaska or in different parts of the Arctic. I'm not talking about the costs that Christina highlighted, which those ones are at the global level, but really in the Arctic, what does it cost to mitigate those consequences? And here, what we estimated is that we have see that's a very large bracket here between 84 here billion dollars and 190 billion dollars GRP for permafrost. If you put into context, we have estimations right now of damage control in Alaska alone from permafrost, so in amounts that are very closing up to this kind of amounts of the annual GRP. So we are in the same order of magnitude here, alone just for consequences, so engineering consequences of permafrost thaw. And 92% of that GRP is located on the Russian territory. And the Russian territory is very much of a black box now. Since the invasion of Ukraine, we have very little information and very little or close to non-interaction with the Russian scientists. So like this follow-up on this kind of issues is very difficult. So on this diagram I'm going to show you, and I showed it earlier today, what I want to show you is what happened over the period 1999 to 2017 for many or for most of the communities located on permafrost that exceed 5,000 inhabitants. So we'll start here with a diagram where on the left you have the cooler permafrost, that's permafrost that is by -10, and warmer permafrost are close to up to +2 here on that diagram. So obviously communities that are going to be more in the north, that's going to be located more on the left part of that side of that slide, and then the one close to the edge of the southern edge of permafrost located here. And then I'm going to show you the amount of warming or cooling those communities have been experiencing over these past 20 years approximately. And these are the communities that have been cooling. You see, barely see those little blue lines here. There are a couple. There is Magadan, which is a pretty large community in Russia, ILLUQ in Canada, but really the huge majority of communities has been experiencing a very substantial warming. And we're not in a warming of 1 degree here. You see that for many communities, especially in the colder part of permafrost, and there are physical reasons for that, are experiencing warming sometimes up to upwards of 3 degrees Celsius. What does it look like on the ground? So this is a picture of Ilulissat, and by the way, most of the maps I'm showing here are extracted from a product we created that is called the Arctic Permafrost Atlas, and it's available online. You can Google it. It's beautiful maps that have been created by Grid Arendal. I'd be happy to show you, to send you a version of it if you want, so you send me an email and we can probably make it happen. This is Illulisat with the old community, or where it was located on the left side here, and then the topography, and then all these grayish areas shows like current areas that are currently explored for development, whether it's for the community itself or on the really right on that picture here for the future airport. Superposed on that, you have data that is satellite retrieved, that is looking at the subsidence of the ground per year. And that diagrams here is showing you values that are up in upwards of 8 centimeters a year of that ground that is collapsing. Why is it happening? Because we have ice in the ground, and that ice is not distributed equally on the ground. It's certainly not distributed equally, and any of the maps my colleagues or I have shown will be faithful to the level of spatial variability we have on the ground. So here it makes it very challenging for planners to do that and to understand where to locate future settlements. Then I'll continue and show you some more data on coastal erosion and what that means for coastal communities. About half of the population living on permafrost is located at the coast, about that. And so those communities are likely to experience the consequences of permafrost thaw as subsidence is stripping in and there are impacts on the buildings, but also laterally because coastal erosion, coastal flooding is occurring and will increase exponentially, as Fabian showed before me. These are erosion data. This is erosion data from the Yukon coast, so northwestern Canada, and you see data from 1955 to 1974. 0.4 meters of erosion, which is already very substantial. Any place in Europe experiencing 0.4 meters a year would be directly threatened, would make like huge headlines. Here we had a very substantial increase in the 70s already, 74 to 86, doubling of the rate of erosion, 0.8 meters a year, for a coast that is only exposed 4 months a year. Only 4 months a year are you experiencing the action of waves. The rest of the year you are protected by sea ice that is there. So the lengthening of that season is directly responsible for the increase of those rates of erosion. Then we had a very substantial increase in 96 to 2007 where we jumped to 2 meters a year, and this is the latest data. So you see that now this section of course has seen like a very dramatic increase. There is a landing strip there, and this landing strip are really the vital organs for some of the communication between infrastructure, defense infrastructure, but community infrastructure in this part of the globe, and that has very direct consequences because the costs of, to mitigate those impacts are enormous. A disclaimer is that this is not the rate of erosion for the Arctic. It's for that specific location where the rates are very, very high. But the rates of erosion are increasing virtually everywhere in the Arctic, especially when there are communities. So here, I'm showing you on that same map again, all of these communities here that are shown in red will be likely to experience consequences from erosion by 2100. And by consequences, I mean potential relocation, which is already occurring in some of these communities, because I'm not talking necessarily about the entire community, but some buildings have to be moved in other places to be preserved from erosion. And that has the consequences, all these processes that go beyond like the destruction of infrastructure. If you look at it in a One Health perspective, this is again a very nice cartoon from the Permafrost Atlas here that is showing you the complex and holistic nature of the consequences of permafrost thaw. There is lots of contaminants, and I'll show you a map later on, contained in the ground. That contaminants made it through river. It's eroded at the coast. Also, because it contains permafrost, makes its way into the bodies of marine mammals, and then ultimately can have health consequences both on people but also on other animals. So all of this is really intertwined and linked, and this is what we're trying to do in this project I'm working on, which is called ILLUQ, where we're really trying to include practitioners, medical doctors, community members, of course, economists, demographers, and of course permafrost specialists to embrace that diversity and understand what those consequences will be in the Arctic. And I'll finish with that picture. That man is Richard Gordon. I've known him for 20 years. And he's really taught me a lot of things about working in the Arctic. And I think it's important to remember that wherever we go in the Arctic, we always often come from the south. And we often guest in northern communities where we work. And it takes a long time to build a relation of trust with people that are on site and to have a respectful and meaningful way to contribute to issues that are directly relevant to northern communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, now I can hear myself at least. Okay, so thanks. So I think we'll just give an opportunity to open the floor for any questions, if there are any questions for any of the speakers. Towards the end here, yeah.
Thank you to all of you for those really excellent presentations. I think they've been really superb and super informative in terms of the long-term impacts of this on the world, but also the relevance for these negotiations too. Question about rates of coastal erosion from permafrost thaw. I was pretty stunned by the figures you showed from that one particular location, but I wonder, is there a physical limit on how quickly coastal erosion can happen because of, you know, how quickly can you basically thaw ice and collapse the coastline?
Don't know if, yeah, you can hear me. That's a very good question, James. It's very complex to answer. I wish I had like 30 minutes to answer that question. But first and foremost, there are physical limits to the system, and then there are places where you will never reach 30 meters per year, which is, by the way, kind of what we're observing now at the maximum location in the Arctic, which is called Drew Point, and is located in Alaska. So when you have like steep coasts where you have permafrost that is less ice rich, there like the potential is much less because you need to evacuate a lot of the material out of the coastal system before you do that. But there are some locations here, point for now, you haven't reached that potential because there is no beach, which is essential. So the water is directly in contact with the cliff and does so from the onset of the season, unlike many locations in the Arctic. So you have direct melting of that ice that is in the permafrost. It's very ice rich and it's very low elevation. Well, it's not entirely low elevation, but 3 to 4 meter low elevation. So you combine a lot of factors that are there. But those places are very seldom. There, what I showed, Stokes Point, is somewhat similar, but it depends on what you have in the background. And also one thing that we didn't mention is how much sea level rise you have. So at some point it's going to equalize or not, but I think that's going to depend. There's going to be a lot of variability along the coastline. Added to that we don't have yet a good physical model. So the models that Fabian showed, showing erosion, this is a very basic model that is based on statistics that has one indicator for thermal denudation, which is basically the action that is happening above the water, and one for the waves. But that's it. It's very simple. So we're lacking a physical model to fully embrace those, include those processes and provide a reliable answer to your question.
So, Pam, please go ahead.
I'm actually transferring a question that I got a couple of weeks ago from a community in Alaska, and I think this might actually be a question for Christina, because they were citing the Permafrost Pathways website, but I've heard many of you say this, that the IPCC climate modeling, the projections, don't adequately take into account permafrost emissions. And we've had some back and forth sometimes with IPCC authors on this where they say, yes, it is, of course we do. I'm wondering if you want to comment on that and what needs to change then in AR7.
Yeah, that's a... Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks, Pam. So IPCC does include some form of gradual thaw, which is the top-down thawing only. It does not include in the model projections any of the abrupt thaw or wildfire permafrost thaw interactions. And that's because these processes are really difficult to model they're complicated. They're often happening on very. The Arctic is heterogeneous. It's difficult to know exactly how and where this all happens to then put it into a model and to project. And then another. Often model development happens as an add-on on projects. There's often not enough direct funding just to really improve models. And these are not things you can just do within a month on the side. You actually really have to have very capable and dedicated people working on that for a while. And then, yeah, I would say those are some of the limitations. We also have some data limitations. If you include new processes in models, you always want to make sure that you're using data to really verify and benchmark what you have in models. That's also lacking. There are multiple reasons, but yes, permafrost is included with gradual thaw to some extent in IPCC models, but none of the abrupt thaw or wildfire interactions. And as you can see, those were really high extra numbers.
And do you expect it to be taken? Do you expect to be taken more into account in AR7? Are the right people involved as lead authors? Or I guess a lot of that is just making sure the proper papers come out, right?
That's a good point. The proper papers need to come out, and we do have some very good people, some of my colleagues on the IPCC panels, not panels, on the IPCC authors. We do hope to make progress. Whether these processes will be included in Earth system models in a very meaningful way and in more than one model remains to be seen. I think if there is a good push for funding to really develop these processes in models, we have a good chance, but time is running out, so.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit on that. I will actually be also in the next in AR7 in the chapter focusing on future projections. And I think it's important to make the distinction about, because I mean, as Christina says, it's definitely true that so you often hear that it's not included in the IPCC models specifically, and then we refer to CMIP6, which is the coupled model intercomparison project, the sixth phase, which was the base of a lot of the data that went into AR6, the chapter, and there only 2 of the models had permafrost gradual thaw included, and none of the models had any abrupt thaw. So only 2 of a very large amount of models had even gradual thaw. But then the IPCC report did include, but separately, not based on CMIP6, but on separate, basically a paper synthesis or a meta-analysis. They try to account for permafrost thaw emissions on the site. So it's mentioned and quantified in the report, but it's not in the models. And then for CMIP7, that goes into the next cycle, those model versions are already locked in, and unfortunately there are still relatively few models that will have permafrost represented. There are a lot more models that can do it, but these are typically not the trunk versions like the versions that are used globally. They are often Arctic specific model versions that are really developed to work really well in the Arctic, but the model that works the best in the Arctic might not be so good in the tropics, or it might have other issues, so that the trunk version that works globally typically doesn't have permafrost included, even in the models in the modeling groups that do have these capabilities. So it's this challenge of finding a model that works okay everywhere, which is not always an easy thing to do.
Hi. Thank you very much for the panel. I work on net zero, and I think about your point about the likelihood we have of overshoot is at least of 1.5, probably significantly more. And I'm wondering if there are any additional mitigation methods or more community adaptation mechanisms that are being worked on that need investment in, or if it really is just a case of temperatures are too high and it's irreversible loss.
Unfortunately, with permafrost, there is really not much you can do except just avoided emissions. I think every decade, every decade we lose 200,000-300,000 square kilometers of permafrost, and the sort of accelerated irreversible loss that will happen during overshoot will stay on the ground and will keep emitting for centuries. It will at some point stabilize, but that's several hundred years into the future. So, every decade we are in overshoot is really serious for the permafrost region. There are some things you can do locally. You can try to mitigate fire better, try to really manage fire better. So either extinguish fires when they occur, and also do sort of do more careful management burns to limit dampen the fire cycle. and in some places you might limit the thaw locally to protect infrastructure, but to do something that really spans across the whole permafrost region and limit emissions in some sort of geoengineering solution is simply not feasible. It's too large, it's too remote, and there are no feasible geoengineering solutions to this. It's really emission reductions. Rapid emission reductions is the only path forward.
But I would say there is a growing awareness in communities and also some efforts to build capacity in these communities. Like it's, I think we see a lot of positive echo whenever a partnership happens between us or like colleagues in Canada or anywhere when they do that. And the idea there is to understand like this permafrost that is seen from above but you don't see, to understand that notion, that very abstract notion that this very strong variability of permafrost under the ground, and there are methods to do that, and I think we're moving forward with that.
Okay, I think with this we are really at time. We're even 5 minutes past. So thanks all of you that listened, and thanks again to the speakers.